It took me 2 full years to realize that when your absolute world collapses, the universe doesn't stop to give you a moment to grieve. It just keeps moving, completely indifferent to the fact that you're drowning. My name is Pauline Matthews, and I'm 68 years old. Orch, if you had told me 2 years ago that at my age, I'd be down on my hands and knees in a stranger's garden, dirt packed deep under my fingernails, selling my physical labor for $2,500 a month, just to have a roof over my head and a bed to sleep in, I would have thought you were telling a cruel joke. But that is reality. Orch. When the love of your life, my husband Conrad, loses a 3-year battle with cancer, the heavy iron hammer of real life falls without mercy. Orch. That's the price you pay when you're staring down $350,000 in medical bills, while cold-hearted American health insurance companies comb through 40-page policies just to find every possible loophole, denying your claims under the guise of experimental treatments or out-of-network care. Orch. 8 months after Conrad passed, I finally accepted a bitter truth. The cozy little home on Maple Street that held over 30 years of our memories was no longer mine. The bank's foreclosure specialist was patient, I'll give him that. When he handed me the final notice, his eyes reflected that genuine yet completely powerless sympathy so typical of the American middle class. Orch. But sympathy doesn't pay a monthly mortgage. As a retired public elementary school teacher who spent 40 years in the classroom, my meager $1,200 pension was barely enough to cover basic groceries, let alone pay down the mountain of medical debt that followed me like a shadow. Mrs. Henderson at the employment agency had a good heart. Orch. She looked at me with that same pitiful expression I had grown to despise. She told me that at my age, given my current financial situation, live-in domestic work was really my best option. She said a position offering room and board would cover my largest living expenses and help me bypass those grueling rental credit checks. Orch. Her words were gentle, but the message was crystal clear. A 68-year-old widow with ruined credit and zero financial standing is hardly a hot commodity in today's ruthless job market. So, on a gloomy October morning, I packed up my old Honda Civic and drove up the long, winding driveway of the Blackwood Estate in Fairfield County, Connecticut. Orch. The massive mansion towered before me, its pure white neoclassic pillars and immaculately manicured lawns almost suffocating in their perfection. As my tires rolled forward, I felt smaller and smaller. I had spent 4 decades educating children, owned my own home, and was a respected member of my community. Now, I was arriving as the hired help. Orch. The estate's head gardener, Thomas, met me at the service entrance. He was a weathered man whose eyes gave away the fact that he had seen plenty of desperate people come and go. He looked me up and down and said, "You're the new gardener. It wasn't a question. Mrs. Henderson said you have experience." I just nodded, not trusting my own voice enough to speak. Experience was a generous word. Orch. The truth was, Conrad and I had spent 37 years working in our backyard garden together. We grew tomatoes and roses, even winning a few blue ribbons at the county fair. But this was a completely different ballgame. This was a symbol of pure capital and power, and I was just trying to survive. Thomas told me to follow him and led the way down a natural slate pathway. Orch. That path alone probably cost more than 10 years of my salary. He explained that the Blackwood family was extremely strict about their privacy. The core family lived in the main house. Mr. Richard Blackwood was a self-made billionaire, with tech ventures across Silicon Valley and the East Coast. His current wife, Victoria, was obsessed with keeping everything done strictly by the book. Orch. Then there was a little girl, Sophie, who was 7 years old. At a fork in the path, Thomas stopped, his posture softening slightly. He mentioned that the estate manager, Mr. Carlisle, would handle my official onboarding, but he wanted to tell me something crucial first. He pointed up and asked if I saw the bay window with the blue cushions on the second floor. Orch. I followed his gaze to a large window on the upper level, where I could just make out a tiny, motionless figure sitting quietly, looking down at the garden. Thomas told me that was Sophie's room. She spent most of her time sitting right there, just watching. It had been going on for 3 years. Ever since her mother vanished from her life, she hadn't uttered a single word. Not one. Top child psychologists from Los Angeles to New York called it selective mutism, a symptom of severe emotional trauma. Mrs. Blackwood, Victoria, had tried everything: expensive therapists, behavioral specialists, and was now even looking into sending her to a specialized boarding facility overseas. My heart sank. In my 40 years of teaching, I had seen far too many children carrying deep wounds. I knew the signs of buried trauma all too well. It takes root deep inside, capable of altering the very core of a child's spirit. Thomas lowered his voice and said that Mr. Carlyle and the rest of the staff had a silent agreement with the family. They were never to interact with Sophie. Mrs. Blackwood believed it was better for the child to minimize distractions, or so she claimed. He warned me that while I might see her around, I had to keep a strict distance. I wanted to push back. I wanted to tell him, as an educator, that cold distance and isolation never healed a broken heart. But I desperately needed this job. I needed that modest room in the staff quarters, the stable meals, and a fresh start. So I swallowed my pride and gave a quiet nod. The estate manager, Mr. Carlyle, was everything you'd expect from a butler serving top-tier American wealth. Tall, impeccably tailored, moving with an air of rigid authority built on years of catering to high society. He guided me through a maze of service hallways to my room, a clean, modest space tucked under the eaves with a window overlooking the rear garden. He laid out my duties in a crisp, professional tone. I was responsible for maintaining the French formal garden, the rose beds, and the greenhouse. Mrs. Blackwood was hosting a high-profile garden party for her charitable foundation in 6 weeks, attended by prominent political and business figures, so every single plant had to be flawless. The household kept a tight schedule: breakfast at 7, lunch at 1, and dinner at 7. Staff ate together in the kitchen. Sundays were my day and a half off, though I was expected to remain on the estate grounds unless given prior approval. As he turned to leave, he paused and added, "And Pauline, if I may call you Pauline. Regarding the little girl, it's best for everyone if you maintain proper boundaries. That child has been through enough instability." Once Carlyle left, I sat down on the narrow single bed and looked around my new home: 4 walls, a small dresser, and a window with a view. It wasn't luxury, but as long as I kept this job, it was my sanctuary. I unpacked my belongings: practical work clothes, my personal gardening tools, and a small wooden box holding my most cherished possessions. My wedding ring, which I still wore, a photograph of Conrad and me on our honeymoon in Yellowstone, and a small journal where we had logged our gardening notes over the decades. What thrived, what withered, what brought us joy. At the very bottom of the box, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was my life's pride: rose seeds. Conrad and I spent 5 years cross-pollinating in our backyard. We had created a unique hybrid: a deep crimson bloom with remarkable resistance to harsh New England winters and a fragrance rich enough to fill an entire yard. I had planned to name it Conrad's memory and enter it in state flower shows. Now it felt like the last tangible piece of the life we built together. The next morning, I began my work. The Blackwood Gardens were undeniably breathtaking. Acres of manicured hedges, flower beds that looked like they belonged in Architectural Digest, and a climate-controlled greenhouse more advanced than most commercial nurseries. But everything felt cold, clinical, and sterile, like a museum display rather than a living space. That afternoon, while trimming rose bushes near the main house, I felt a pair of eyes on me. I looked up and saw Sophie sitting at her window, her pale face pressed against the glass. She looked tiny, frail, with large, deep, dark eyes. She had her father's dark hair, but her expression held a heavy, ancient sadness that no 7-year-old should ever carry. Our eyes locked for just a brief second before she retreated like a startled deer, disappearing into the shadows of her room. But that fleeting moment awakened something in me that I thought had died. Maybe it was my teacher's instinct, or the part of my soul that was always drawn to quiet children who locked their pain away in silence. Porch. That evening, after finishing my rounds in the greenhouse, I made a choice that would change everything. I took a single seed of Conrad's memory from my wooden box and planted it in a small pot using a custom soil mix of compost and nutrients. It was a huge risk. The seeds were irreplaceable, but my gut told me I had to do it. Porch. Over the next 2 weeks, I secretly nurtured the little pot, hiding it in a quiet corner of the greenhouse where family and staff rarely ventured. I held my breath, waiting for the first green shoot to break through the soil just like Conrad and I used to do. When that tiny sprout finally emerged, I felt a spark I thought was long gone. Hope. Porch. In that controlled environment, the plant grew with astonishing speed, far stronger than I expected. By early November, it produced its very first bloom. It was flawless. Deep crimson petals with a subtle trace of pink at the edges, carrying a sweet, complex scent. Conrad would have been so proud. That was when I took the action that set the wheels of fate in motion. Porch. On a chilly November morning, while the house was busy preparing for Mrs. Blackwood's charity breakfast, I picked that precious rose, the first and only blossom of Conrad's memory, placed it in a small glass vase from the greenhouse and set it on the windowsill outside Sophie's room. I left no note, made no noise, and simply walked away. Porch. As I rounded the corner of the house, I couldn't help but glance back. Sophie was at the window, her tiny hands pressed against the glass, staring down at the rose with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met once more, and this time she didn't hide. Porch. 3 weeks later, on a morning when light snow began dusting the manicured lawns, I was working near the back of the estate when a voice behind me caused my heart to stop. It was faint, almost like a whisper. "Play with me." I turned around slowly. Porch. Sophie was standing at the edge of the French garden, bundled in a small coat and boots, clutching my rose like it was made of the most fragile glass in the world. She looked straight at me and spoke again, her voice clear despite its quietness. "Play with me." This time, there was a desperate plea in her tone. Porch. I froze in the November morning sun, my pruning shears forgotten in my hand, staring at the little girl who had just broken 3 years of silence. She hugged the rose tight against her chest like a lifeline, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "Play with me," she said a third time. Porch. I realized then that she was trembling. Not from the cold, but because breaking 3 years of silence had taken every ounce of courage she possessed. Every cell in my body urged me to run over, hug her, and reassure her that of course I would play with her. But Thomas's warnings rang in my ears, and Mr. Carlyle's strict rules about keeping employee boundaries hung over my head like a sword. Porch. I glanced at the main house, half expecting Victoria to appear at a window to fire me on the spot. "Sophie," I said gently, kneeling down to meet her gaze, "you have a very special flower there. Do you like it?" She gave a serious nod, her grip on the vase never easing. Up close, I could see how thin she was. Her designer coat hung loosely on her small frame. Porch. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her hair needed brushing. "My grandmother used to grow roses too," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "Before she left." "Grandmother?" My heart squeezed. For a 7-year-old, a mother might be remembered as a distant figure, especially if she was the primary caregiver. Porch. I wondered what stories the adults had fed her about her mother leaving. "Would you like to help me grow some more roses?" I asked, making a decision that could cost me my livelihood. "I know a special spot where they'll grow strong." A genuine smile broke across her face, the first I had ever seen. She nodded eagerly. Porch. Taking her small hand, I led her toward an almost forgotten corner at the back of the estate, where a high brick wall enclosed a small, overgrown garden plot. It had likely been a kitchen garden once, but was now overrun with weeds and brambles. This will be our secret garden, I told her, pushing open the rusted iron gate. Just for you and me. How does that sound? Porch. I like it, she whispered, a simple phrase carrying the weight of a child who had kept her voice locked away for far too long. For the next hour, we cleared a small patch of dirt. Sophie worked beside me with surprising determination. She was stronger than she looked, driven by a deep need for purpose and human connection. Porch. As we worked, she began sharing fragmented memories in hushed tones, recalling roses she used to see, a fountain that used to spray water, and a hiding spot where she and her grandmother used to play. She had dark hair like yours, Sophie said suddenly, looking up with sharp eyes. And she smelled like flowers, not perfume. Mrs. Victoria always smells like heavy perfume. Mrs. Porch. Victoria, not Mom, not even Victoria, but a cold, formal title, as if referring to a total stranger in her own home. Tell me about your grandmother, I invited gently while clearing weeds. Sophie went quiet for a long moment, methodically picking stones out of the dirt. She used to read to me, she finally offered. Real storybooks, not the books about success and etiquette, Mrs. Porch. Victoria picks out. And when she thought no one was listening, she would sing. She had a music box with a dancing lady inside. Those were memories of a mother, not a grandmother. I was certain of it. The real question was, what had actually happened to her mother? And why was Sophie calling her grandmother? Do you miss her? I asked. The little girl's hands stopped. Porch. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at me. She promised she would come back, she choked out. She said she would never really leave me. But Mrs. Victoria said she was lying. She said she got tired of taking care of me and left to pursue her own freedom. I tightened my grip on the weeds in my hand. Porch. What kind of person tells a child that her own mother abandoned her because she was a burden? I forced my voice to stay calm. Sometimes adults have to leave even when they don't want to. But that doesn't mean they stop loving us. Sophie nodded earnestly, as if processing a truth she had been trying to digest for years. That's what I thought, too. But whenever I say that, Mrs. Victoria gets mad. Porch. She calls me silly and tells me I need to accept reality. We worked in comfortable silence after that. I watched the remarkable child beside me, carrying such a heavy emotional load all on her own. There was a deep intelligence in her eyes, the kind I had seen in my brightest students. Children who saw far more than adults realized understanding the world in ways that both amazed and worried me. Porch. Once the patch was cleared, I had Sophie help me plant 3 more of my precious seeds. I showed her how to loosen the soil, give the seeds room to breathe, and practice the patience that gardening requires. When will they bloom? She asked, carefully packing dirt over the last seed. If we take good care of them, we'll see flowers by next summer, I told her. Porch. The first lesson a garden teaches us is patience. Good things take time. She nodded solemnly, then looked up at me with a maturity far beyond her 7 years. Mrs. Pauline, will you still be here next summer? The question hit me like a blow to the chest. In her short life, this child had learned that people disappear, promises break, and even mothers can vanish without explanation. Porch. And I was just a hired hand, easily replaced and let go at a moment's notice. What right did I have to make promises? I'll do everything I can to stay, I said eventually. But Sophie, even if something happens and I have to leave, it will never be because I don't care about you. Sometimes grown-ups don't get to choose where they live or work. Porch. She searched my face carefully, then gave a single nod. Just like my grandmother? Yes, I said softly. Just like your grandmother. Over the next few weeks, we met in secret several more times in our hidden garden whenever Victoria and the staff were occupied. Porch. Sophie would appear like a little ghost, usually carrying the vase with my rose. She had somehow managed to keep that single flower alive in her room. We worked together, planting and pruning, and gradually she opened up more. She talked about the strict tutor Victoria had hired, a woman who believed children should be seen and not heard. Porch. She mentioned the high-priced therapists who asked endless questions, trying to analyze her silence. never understanding that she simply had nothing to say to them. And she spoke about lying awake late at night, listening to heated arguments between her father and Victoria. Though she couldn't understand the complex financial terms, she recognized the cold, angry tone all too well. "Porch. Daddy is always busy," she said one afternoon while we watered the seedlings. "He's always on video calls in his study or flying away. Mrs. Victoria says he's a very important man with big business to manage." "What about you?" I asked. "Are you important too?" She looked at me in surprise, as if the thought had never crossed her mind. "I don't know," she whispered. "Mrs. Porch. Victoria says I'm difficult. She says if I just tried harder to be normal, everyone would be much happier." Normal. As if a grieving 7-year-old using silence to protect herself was somehow at fault. As if trauma were a character flaw rather than a natural response to overwhelming loss. "Sophie," I said firmly, "you are not difficult. Porch. You are a little girl who went through something very sad, and you are doing the best you can. That's all any of us can do." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Mrs. Victoria wants to send me to a special school. I heard her talking to Daddy. Porch. She said I need professional round-the-clock intervention, and that it's not fair to expect her to handle a child who refuses to accept normal family life." My blood ran cold. A special school. In wealthy circles, that was a polite term for an institution. Porch. Over my decades in education, I had seen it happen before. When a child became inconvenient, they were labeled troubled and sent away, rather than given the love and patience they needed. "When did you hear this?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Last week. They were in Daddy's study after dinner. Mrs. Victoria was crying, saying she tried her best, but I was giving her a breakdown. Porch. She said if they sent me somewhere for troubled children, maybe I'd finally talk to the right people." Troubled, as if reaching out to a kindly gardener for comfort instead of yielding to a cold stepmother was proof of mental instability. "And what did your father say?" "He said he'd think about it. Whenever Mrs. Porch. Victoria wants something, he says he'll think about it, but he usually gives in." That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. Sophie wasn't getting the emotional support she needed at home, and now they were discussing sending her away. Porch. Everything in me as an educator revolted against the idea of shipping a sensitive child off to a facility simply because she was inconvenient. But what power did I have? I was just a gardener working for room and board. I had no legal rights, no authority, no resources. The next morning, while working in the greenhouse, I heard Victoria arguing sharply on the phone near the main house. "No, Dr. Porch. Martinez, I don't think outpatient therapy is working," she was saying. "She's seen specialists for 3 years with zero progress. Now she's exhibiting concerning new behaviors. I caught her talking to herself outside yesterday, lost in some imaginary scenario. Things are getting worse, not better." I froze, watering can in hand. Porch. Talking to herself. Victoria had seen Sophie in our garden, talking to me, but through her class snobbery and prejudice, she interpreted it as a breakdown rather than a breakthrough. A residential facility would provide the intensive structure she clearly needs. Victoria continued. And frankly, it would give our family a chance to heal. This situation is putting immense strain on my marriage. Porch. Marriage strain. She didn't care about Sophie's well-being. She cared about her own comfort and status as a wealthy wife. "I understand the tuition is high, but money isn't an issue. Her father can easily afford it. Frankly, I see it as our only option. She's becoming more withdrawn and erratic every day." I set the watering can down and walked toward the house, my mind racing. Porch. Sophie was on the verge of being sent away simply because she found comfort in our friendship instead of accepting Victoria's performative mothering. As I rounded the corner by the rose beds, I caught movement at Sophie's window. She was there as usual, but today she was pressing a piece of paper against the glass. Porch. Even from a distance I could tell it was a drawing. Stick figures in a garden, one tall and one small, surrounded by flowers. She had drawn us, our secret time together. If Victoria saw that drawing and realized what it meant, Sophie would be sent away so fast, none of us could stop it. Porch. I had to find a way to protect this child, even if it meant risking the modest shelter I had managed to secure for myself. The opportunity to uncover the truth came 3 days later when Victoria left for a luxury weekend spa retreat in Aspen, Colorado. Porch. She had been unusually tense all week, making constant calls to doctors and high-end educational consultants, her voice carrying that sharp edge that signaled she was plotting something behind closed doors. "I need time to recharge," she announced at breakfast, speaking more to Carlisle than to her husband or stepdaughter. "The stress of Sophie's condition is suffocating." Doctor. Porch. Martinez agrees that some distance will help me view our next steps objectively. Richard barely raised his eyes from his copy of the Wall Street Journal. "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need." Sophie picked at her scrambled eggs without a word, but I noticed her tense shoulders relax the moment Victoria disappeared through the front doors. Porch. With Victoria gone, the heavy atmosphere in the house lifted. The constant feeling of being watched evaporated. Richard retreated into his study as usual, absorbed in endless video calls and corporate reports, leaving Sophie to wander the halls like a quiet shadow. While trimming the hedges near the sunroom, I saw her slip out the back door and head straight for our secret garden. Porch. I waited a few minutes before following her. I found her sitting cross-legged on the ground where we had planted the rose seeds, whispering softly to the tiny green shoots peeking through the soil. "They're growing," she said, her voice filled with wonder as she noticed me. "Look, Mrs. Pauline, they really came up." I knelt beside her to inspect the delicate leaves. "Porch. They're strong, just like you," I said. "Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest places." Sophie fell silent for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Victoria left because of me, didn't she? Because I'm too much trouble." My heart ached for her. How had she learned to blame herself every time an adult walked away? "No, sweetheart. Mrs. Victoria left because she needed a break." Porch. "That's about her, not you." "She still wants to send me away," Sophie said with heartbreaking calmness. "I heard her talking to Daddy again last night. She found a school in Switzerland for children like me." Switzerland. My blood ran cold. That wasn't just a facility. It was an overseas exile, thousands of miles from everything Sophie knew. Porch. In elite circles, it was the ultimate respectable way to abandon a child. "Children like me," Sophie repeated, echoing words she had overheard. "Broken children who refused to fit into a normal family." She said maybe if I was around other broken kids, I'd learn how to be normal. Broken children. The casual cruelty of those words made it hard to breathe. Porch. She was a grieving 7-year-old protecting herself with silence, not a defective product meant to be sent away for repairs. "Sophie," I asked carefully, "how much do you remember about the time before Mrs. Victoria moved here? About your life with your grandmother?" Her face lit up with a pure, radiant warmth I hadn't seen before. Everything was different then. Porch. The house was full of music and laughter. We'd bake cookies in the kitchen, and she'd let me lick the frosting off the spoon. She read me stories every night, and on Sundays, we had picnics right here in the garden. She pointed around us. This place used to look completely different. It was full of flowers and vegetables, and there was a little pond with koi fish. Porch. Grandmother called it our secret base, where we could just be ourselves, without worrying about being perfect. The picture she painted was night and day compared to the cold, sterile environment I saw today. It had been a real home where a child was allowed to be a child, where joy was welcomed rather than suppressed. "What happened to change all that?" I asked gently. Sophie's expression darkened. Porch. Grandmother got sick, very sick. Sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she would cry softly. She got thinner and thinner, doctors were always coming by, and people were always whispering in the halls. Sick. Not abandonment, not growing tired of being a mother, she was sick. Then Mrs. Victoria showed up. At first, she was just Daddy's friend visiting occasionally. Porch. When grandmother got really sick, she was extra nice to me, bringing expensive gifts and telling stories about her travels. But after, her voice trailed off, eyes filling with tears. After what, sweetheart? After the funeral, she whispered. After grandmother went to heaven. Mrs. Victoria moved in to take care of us. But she said I was a big girl now and didn't need that babying anymore. Orch. She said I had to learn to be independent and grow up. The funeral. So Sophie's mother had passed away, and Victoria had stepped in during the family's darkest moment, positioning herself as the ideal solution to Richard's life as a single father. But why did Sophie keep calling her mother grandmother? Orch. Sophie, I chose my words with extreme care. When you say grandmother, do you mean your father's mother? The grandmother who lived with you? Sophie looked at me, confused. No, silly. I mean my maternal grandmother, Sarah, my mom's mom. When my mom couldn't take care of me anymore, she was the one who raised me. My world spun. Orch. Her mother couldn't take care of her, so her maternal grandmother stepped in. Then the grandmother passed away, and Victoria married Richard. But what had actually happened to Sophie's biological mother? Where is your mother now, Sophie? The little girl scowled. Mrs. Victoria said Mom ran off because she was tired of the responsibility. Orch. She said Mom was too young when she had me, and when grandmother Sarah got sick, she saw a chance to run away and live her own life. Mrs. Victoria said some people just aren't built to be parents. Yet something in Sophie's tone told me she didn't believe that story any more than I did. What do you think happened to your mother? Orch. Sophie glanced around to make sure we were completely alone, then leaned in close. I think Mrs. Victoria is lying, she whispered. I found things in the attic I wasn't supposed to see. That night, after dinner service ended and the estate fell silent, Sophie appeared outside my door. It was a clear violation of household rules. Staff and family quarters were strictly separated. Orch. But the look in her eyes told me this was urgent. Mrs. Pauline, she whispered, will you come with me? I want to show you something, but I'm scared to go alone. I checked the hallway. Richard was shut away in his study, likely working late into the night on his business empire. The rest of the staff had retired to their quarters. It was safe. Orch. Sophie led me up the grand staircase, past the bedroom wing, to a narrow door I had never noticed before. She pulled a small key from her pocket. Grandmother gave me this before she got really sick, she explained. She said it opened the door to our memories, and that when I was ready, I should look inside. Orch. The attic was dark, dusty, and packed with generations of expensive heirlooms, white-sheeted antique furniture, boxes of rare books, old oil paintings. But Sophie walked straight to a specific corner where an old leather trunk sat beneath a skylight. It's all in here, she said, lifting the lid. Everything about my real mom. Orch. Inside was a treasure trove of memories. Thick photo albums filled with pictures of a young woman who looked like an adult version of Sophie. Same dark hair, same sharp, intelligent eyes, same delicate features. There were photos of her college graduation, her wedding to Richard in a church, her pregnancy, and the radiant joy on her face as she held baby Sophie. This is your mother, I whispered. Orch. Sophie nodded. Her name was Elena. Grandmother told me she was the most beautiful person inside and out, and that she loved me more than anything in the world. I flipped through the album, tracing Elena's life, deeply in love with Richard, painting in a sunlit studio, teaching Sophie to walk, read, and plant flowers in the garden. Then, the photos thinned out until they stopped entirely. Orch. What really happened to her, Sophie? What's the truth? Sophie pulled a brown paper accordion folder from the bottom of the trunk. Inside were medical records, legal documents, and yellowed newspaper clippings. As I read the headlines, my heart nearly stopped. Local artist killed in car crash. Young mother dies in Interstate 91 rear-end collision. Orch. Elena Blackwood, 26, died instantly after a head-on collision with a drunk driver on I-91. She is survived by her grieving husband, Richard, and 4-year-old daughter, Sophie. Sophie hadn't been abandoned. Her mother's life was cut short when she was just 4 years old. But why couldn't she remember? Why did she grow up believing her maternal grandmother was her primary caregiver? Torch. The answers were right there in the medical records beneath those news clippings. After Elena died, Sophie suffered severe trauma and depression, eventually being admitted to a pediatric psychiatric unit. She stopped speaking, refused to eat, and experienced what doctors described as a total psychological collapse. Torch. Devastated by the loss of his wife, Richard was completely unequipped to handle his daughter's condition. That was when Elena's mother, Sarah, stepped in. She moved into the Blackwood estate to care for Sophie full-time. For 2 whole years, with endless patience, she helped her granddaughter slowly heal from the nightmare of losing her mother. In Sophie's young mind, those 2 years became her happiest memories. A time when her grandmother Sarah made her feel safe and loved once again. Then Sarah was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. Medical records showed she fought for 8 months before passing away when Sophie was 6. The poor child had lost her mother, and just 2 years later, lost the grandmother who saved her. No wonder she retreated right back into total silence, shutting out the rest of the world. "Sophie," I said, stroking her hair with a heavy heart, "do you remember your mother? Your real mother? Elena?" Sophie stayed quiet for a long time, running her tiny fingers over one of the photographs again and again. "Sometimes I dream about her," she whispered at last. "In my dreams, she sings to me and braids my hair. But Mrs. Victoria says those are just fantasies. She says I'm mixing up movies from TV or bedtime stories grandmother used to tell. Victoria, that cruel woman, was systematically erasing Elena's memory. She was conditioning Sophie to believe her own recollections were fake, rewriting history to turn Elena into a villain who abandoned her family instead of a loving mother whose life was cut short by tragedy. Why would Mrs. Victoria tell you your mother abandoned you instead of telling you she passed away?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sophie looked up at me with eyes that saw right through the truth. "Because Mrs. Victoria wanted to be my only mother. Grandmother Sarah told me before she died. She said some people can't tolerate sharing love. They want to be the only person who matters in your life." At the very bottom of the trunk, I found one last item that made every piece of the puzzle fall into place. It was a sealed envelope addressed to Sophie on her 18th birthday. Inside was a handwritten letter from Sarah. "My dearest Sophie," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I am no longer here, and you are finally old enough to understand the truth about your family. Your mother, Elena, was the most loving person I ever knew, and she lost her life protecting that love. She was driving home with a birthday gift for you when the crash happened. She had planned a big surprise party for your 5th birthday, complete with a princess cake and a pony in the backyard." I couldn't read the rest out loud as Sophie began to weep quietly beside me. "I know that by now, someone may have told you Elena left you, that she chose her own happiness over yours. That is a cruel lie meant to make you grateful for whatever substitute affection you're given. Your mother loved you with every fiber of her being, and her final word in this world was your name." The letter detailed Elena's hopes and dreams for Sophie, her plans for her daughter's future, and how desperately she wished for Sophie to remember her with joy rather than sadness. Above all, the letter concluded, "Never let anyone convince you that you are difficult, broken, or unworthy of love. Your mother fought for you every day of her life, and I fought for you every day of mine. Now you must learn to stand up for yourself." Sophie lifted her head, tears streaming down her face. "So my mom didn't leave me?" "No, sweetheart," I said, pulling her tight into my arms. "Your mother loved you so much. She lost her life trying to get home to you. And your grandmother Sarah loved you enough to use her final days ensuring you knew how precious you are. Then why does Mrs. Victoria want to send me away?" I held her tighter, feeling a surge of protective fury ignite in my chest. "Because some people can't handle competition when it comes to love. even if that competition is a little girl who deserves the world. Right there in that dusty attic, standing in the presence of Sophie's true family history, I made a choice that would change both of our lives. Legally, Victoria might have held authority over where Sophie stayed. Porch. But she had no moral right to erase this child's identity and send her off to a treatment center like discarded trash. Sophie deserved to know who she was, where she came from, and how deeply she had been loved. And I was going to make sure she had the chance to stand up for herself, just as her mother and grandmother had done before her. Porch. The only question was how to fight this battle without losing the job I depended on for survival. The very role that allowed me to protect her. Monday morning arrived, and Victoria returned from her spa retreat like a gathering storm, radiating sharp energy and barely suppressed rage. The moment her Mercedes G-Wagon pulled up the driveway, the pressure in the entire house shifted. Porch. Even the rest of the staff seemed to sense the danger, moving quietly with their heads down. I was in the greenhouse tending to spring seedlings when Mr. Carlyle appeared at the door. His usually calm face wore an expression of concern that made my stomach knot. "Mrs. Blackwood wants to see you in the morning room," he said in a strictly business tone. Immediately. Porch. The morning room was Victoria's domain, filled with yellow silk fabrics and fragile antiques. It was the kind of space where you barely dared to breathe for fear of damaging something worth more than your annual income. Victoria stood with her back to me, staring out at the garden. Her posture was rigid, held stiff by managed anger. "Close the door, Pauline," she said without turning around. Porch. I obeyed, my heart pounding. Her tone told me she had rehearsed this conversation over and over while she was away. "How long have you been talking to Sophie?" It was a direct hit, precise as a scalpel. No greetings, no polite pleasantries. Victoria had used her time away to plan exactly how to handle this situation. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Blackwood," I replied carefully. Porch. She turned around and I saw something chilling in her eyes. It wasn't just anger, but a cold, calculating glare. "Don't play dumb with me." Her voice was low and dangerous. "I've been watching, I've been paying attention, and I've been doing my research." She walked over to a small writing desk in the corner and picked up a brown folder. "Mrs. Porch. Henderson at the employment agency was very cooperative. She gave me your full background. The deceased husband, the massive medical debt, the foreclosed home. Quite a tragedy. A woman your age reduced to physical labor just to secure a roof over her head." My throat went dry. She had used her connections to dig into my past, aiming straight for my vulnerable spots. Porch. "She also mentioned how grateful you were for this job, promising you'd do whatever it took to keep it. Given your recent boundaries violation, I find that detail particularly interesting." Victoria opened the folder and pulled out a stack of photographs. When I saw what was on them, my blood ran cold. They were photos of Sophie and me in the secret garden, working side by side, talking, laughing. Porch. Someone had been watching us and documenting every moment. "Thomas keeps a very close eye on things," Victoria smirked, noticing my reaction. "I asked him to keep watch over household security while I was away." Imagine my surprise when he reported that the new gardener was taking unauthorized liberties with my stepdaughter. Thomas. Porch. The man who warned me about boundaries and pretended to care about the rules had been Victoria's informant all along. "Mrs. Blackwood," I began, but she cut me off with a sharp gesture. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her voice rose. Sophie was just making progress with her therapist, finally accepting her new family structure. Porch. Then you show up with your wildflowers and this sickening routine. Suddenly she's talking again, but only to you. "Do you realize you are undermining everything we've worked to build?" Progress. Brainwashing a grieving child into believing her mother abandoned her. That was what she called progress. "I never intended to interfere with her care," I said, choosing each word carefully. Porch. "I was simply showing kindness to a child who seemed lonely." Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Kindness? How noble." But kindness from the wrong person is destructive, Pauline. Sophie doesn't need a substitute grandmother encouraging her delusions. She needs to integrate into her real family. Delusions? Arch. You mean holding on to the love of her mother instead of accepting the story you fabricated? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Sophie is a remarkable child. I found my voice again. She's bright, sensitive, and capable of so much more. More than what? Victoria's eyes flashed with cold anger. More than what I provide for her. Let me tell you the truth about Sophie, Pauline. Arch. She went through trauma, yes. But she's also learned to use that trauma to manipulate adults for extra attention and special treatment. What you see as sensitivity, I see as manipulation. What you call a need for love, I see as a refusal to accept reality. Her callous assessment left me speechless. Arch. That was how she viewed a 7-year-old girl who had lost everything. A manipulator, an inconvenience to be managed. She has suffered immense loss. I couldn't keep the emotion out of my tone. She needs patience and understanding, not what? Not discipline? Not boundaries? Arch. Not expectations to act like a normal child instead of playing the perpetual victim? Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. Let me be clear, Pauline. I have spent 3 years trying to build a stable, orderly environment for Sophie to recover. I will not let a desperate old woman with severe boundary issues ruin my work. A desperate old woman. Arch. The words landed like a physical blow. What hurt most was the truth in them. I was in a difficult position. I desperately needed this job, needed a sense of purpose, needed human connection after losing everything. Now, Victoria turned back toward the window. Here is how this goes. You will cease all contact with Sophie immediately. Arch. No more secret garden, no more flowers on windowsills, and no more fostering inappropriate attachments. You will focus entirely on your gardening duties. And if I don't? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Victoria smiled, like a predator cornering its prey. Then you will be fired on the spot without a reference, and at your age, you will never find another job in this industry. Arch. I have extensive connections throughout Fairfield County and the domestic service field. One phone call from me, and no reputable household will ever hire you. You'll be out on the street. It was a completely solid threat. In high society domestic circles, Victoria's word carried absolute weight. She could easily erase my chances of finding work. Arch. Furthermore, she continued, her tone laced with satisfaction, you should know that with or without your interference, Sophie's future is already set. Dr. Martinez has recommended a top residential facility in Switzerland, the Meadowbrook Institute. The specialists there focus on helping children with severe trauma build proper emotional regulation and social skills. My heart sank. Arch, you're still planning to send her away? I am giving her the professional support she clearly needs, Victoria answered smoothly. Support she will never get in an environment where people indulge her. People like you, who mean well but lack qualifications, encourage her to escape reality. She isn't escaping reality, I countered. Arch. She's a little girl who found someone willing to listen to her and treat her with respect. By feeding her illusions about the past and encouraging her to reject her actual family? Victoria interrupted. Do you know what Sophie told Dr. Martinez last week? She said she found a new grandmother who understands her better than her family. Arch. She said this new person makes her feel safe in a way she hasn't felt since her old grandmother died. Victoria emphasized the words deliberately, clearly aware of Sarah's memory, using Sophie's attachment to me as proof of instability. Dr. Martinez is deeply concerned, Victoria went on. Arch. He says it shows Sophie still can't distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate relationships, seeking parent figures outside the home instead of accepting love within her family. Maybe she seeks connection outside the family because she feels no genuine acceptance inside it, I snapped, throwing caution to the wind. Victoria's expression turned icy cold. What did you say? Arch. I knew I was crossing a line that could cost me everything, but I couldn't stop. This woman was planning to ship Sophie to an overseas facility based on a twisted narrative. I couldn't just stand by. Sophie is a bright, loving child who has endured unimaginable loss. I stood tall, my voice stronger than I expected. She doesn't need to be locked away in an institution. Porch. She needs a home where she feels valued and understood. You think you know her better than her own family? Victoria's voice dropped dangerously low. I know what it feels like to lose everything you love and have to rebuild. I stood my ground. And I know what it feels like to be treated as an inconvenience by the people who should care about your well-being. Porch. A suffocating silence filled the room, thick with tension. Victoria glared at me, her mind clearly calculating how to handle a domestic worker who dared to defy her. Do you know what I think, Pauline? She spoke finally. I think you're projecting your own miserable life onto Sophie. You see a motherless child and imagine you can fill the void. Porch. You're trying to play savior to give your own empty life some meaning. But Sophie doesn't need saving. She needs professional care and a structured home. She walked to the door and turned back to face me. You have 24 hours. 24 hours to decide whether you want to keep this job or keep interfering in Sophie's treatment. Porch. If I see you talk to her again, if I catch you encouraging her stories, or if you give her another flower, I will have you removed from this property immediately. And what about Sophie? I demanded. What happens to her? Victoria offered a triumphant smile. Sophie will be enrolled at the Meadowbrook Institute by the end of the month. It's a structured, highly effective program. Porch. She'll learn to interact properly with authority figures and build healthy attachments with qualified professionals, rather than clinging to household staff. She paused at the door to drop one final bombshell. Oh, and Pauline, if you're thinking of taking this to Richard, don't bother. He has already signed the preliminary paperwork. Porch. He agrees that Sophie needs more intensive help than we can provide at home, especially given her recent regressive behavior. Richard had already agreed. Sophie's fate seemed sealed, and I was powerless to stop it. Unless I risked everything I had left on a battle I had almost no chance of winning. After Victoria left, I sat alone in the morning room, trembling. Porch. The full weight of her threat pressed down on my shoulders. Over the next 24 hours, I had to choose between my own survival and Sophie's well-being. I could keep my job, my security, and my small foothold in the world, at the cost of abandoning a 7-year-old child who trusted me. Porch. Or I could fight for her and lose everything, my position, my shelter, and any chance of future employment in this field. As I sat in that cold room, Sophie's face appeared in my mind. Porch. I remembered the look on her face when she showed me Elena's photos, the wonder in her voice when she spoke of her mother's love, the way her small hands carefully tended the rose seedlings, and her tears as she described listening to adults debate her future in the dark. I realized then that some things are worth risking everything to protect. Porch. The only question was whether I had the courage to stake my entire life on a child who shared none of my blood. I didn't sleep that night. Lying in my small bed beneath the eaves, I stared at the ceiling, wrestling with a choice that would determine both our futures. Outside, a storm gathered, mirroring the turmoil within me. By dawn, my decision was made. Porch. Early the next morning, I found Sophie sitting by the bay window in her nightgown, gazing out at the rain-soaked garden. She looked smaller and more fragile than ever, as if sensing that something fundamental in her fragile world was about to break. I knocked softly on her bedroom door. Porch. I knew that by entering I was shattering every boundary Victoria had set and gambling away everything I had worked for. Sophie turned, and when she saw me, a heartbreaking smile broke across her face. "Mrs. Pauline," she whispered, glancing nervously at the hallway. "Mrs. Victoria said I'm not allowed to talk to you anymore." Porch. "I know, sweetheart," I said gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. "That's why I need to talk to you now, before everything changes." Sophie's expression fell. "Are you leaving?" The question hit me like a lead weight. In her short life, everyone she loved had vanished. First her mother through death, then her grandmother through illness, and now me, because of Victoria's scheme. How could I explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes, to protect someone, you have to risk being separated from them? Sophie, I knelt down to eye level with her. I need you to understand something very important. No matter what happens, no matter what anyone tells you, you are not broken, you are not trouble, and you are not a problem that needs to be fixed. Tears filled her eyes. But Mrs. Victoria says. Mrs. Victoria is wrong, I interrupted firmly. She tells you those things to justify her own choices. But you need to know who you really are. I pulled the photograph from my apron pocket. The one of Elena holding baby Sophie, both of them radiant with pure joy and love. This is your mother, Sophie. Your real mother, Elena. She didn't leave because she didn't love you. When you were 4 years old, she died in a car accident, and the last word she spoke in this world was your name. Sophie took the photo with trembling hands, staring at Elena's face with desperate focus. I remember her, she whispered, tears falling onto the print. I remember her singing to me. That wasn't a dream or a fantasy, I told her. Those are real memories, memories left by a mother who loved you with all her life. Your grandmother Sarah loved you too, fighting to protect you until her very last moment. Then why does Mrs. Victoria want to send me away? I took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back. Because some people can't bear to share love. She wants to be the only important person in your father's life, and your presence reminds him of the life he had before her. A life centered around Elena. Sophie stared at the photo for a long time, before looking up with dark eyes that seemed far too old for her years. What should I do? Before I could answer, the bedroom door flew open. Victoria stood there in a silk robe, her face contorted in rage, no longer bothering to maintain a shred of elegance. What do you think you're doing? She shrieked, advancing into the room like a predator closing in on prey. Sophie instinctively shrank back against the window, clutching the photo tightly against her chest. I stood up slowly, positioning myself between Victoria and the little girl. I am telling Sophie the truth about her family. My voice was steadier than I expected. Victoria's gaze fell on the photograph in Sophie's hands, and a dangerous expression crossed her face. Give that to me, she commanded, reaching toward the child. That belongs in the attic with the rest of the trash. No, Sophie yelled. Though her voice was small, it carried an absolute strength. This is my mom. Your mother abandoned you. Victoria screamed, her mask of high society poise shattering completely. She was a selfish girl who got pregnant too young and regretted it every day until she finally found an excuse to run away. That's not true, Sophie sobbed. Victoria was out of control, unable to stop herself. She left you crying in your crib to go out and party. She complained constantly that having a child ruined her life. She was even planning to leave your father and take half his money right before that crash happened. That accident was her own fault because she drove recklessly whenever she was upset. Every word was a calculated, venomous lie aimed straight at the fragile healing Sophie had begun to feel. I watched the little girl's face twist in agony under Victoria's tirade. Be quiet, I snapped, my temper flaring. She's just a child. She's a disturbed child who needs to live in reality instead of pathetic fairy tales. Victoria barked at me. And you are a delusional old woman feeding her romantic nonsense about a mother who never wanted her. In that moment, something inside Sophie seemed to shift completely. She stood up from the window seat, holding Elena's photograph tight. For the first time since I had met her, she let out a full-throated cry. You're lying! The voice echoed through the room, clear, firm, and unmistakable. Victoria actually recoiled a step, caught off guard by the power in the girl's tone. You're lying about my mom, Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. And you're lying when you say Mrs. Pauline is bad for me. She's the only person in this house who treats me like a real person. Sophie, you need to calm down, Victoria attempted to regain control, but for the first time, I heard a flicker of hesitation in her voice. "I won't calm down," Sophie shouted back, her tone echoing Elena's resilience. "I remember my mom. I remember her reading to me, singing to me, and telling me she loved me more than all the stars in the sky. She didn't leave me. She died trying to come home to me." Victoria turned pale. The girl in front of her was no longer the quiet, broken child she had manipulated for 3 years. This was a child who had reclaimed her voice and was using it to stand her ground. "And I know you want to send me away?" Tears streamed down Sophie's face, but her voice didn't waver. "I heard you talking to the doctor about that school in Switzerland. You think I'm a burden, and you want me gone so you can have Daddy all to yourself. That's not." Victoria tried to argue. Sophie cut her off instantly. "Mrs. Pauline is the only one who is kind to me. She listens to me, teaches me to grow flowers, and makes me feel like I'm not broken. But now you want to take her away too. Just like you took all of my mom's pictures, grandmother Sarah's music box, and everything that helped me remember. I used to be happy." The accusations hung in the air like heavy smoke, impossible to ignore. Victoria looked back and forth between Sophie and me, her mind clearly struggling to manage a situation that had spiraled completely out of her control. "Sophie," she adopted a patronizing, soothing tone. "You're confused right now. Mrs. Pauline has filled your head with false stories." "She told me the truth," Sophie shouted. "She showed me the newspaper articles about the crash and the letter grandmother Sarah wrote. I know what happened, and I know you've been lying to me about everything." Victoria's face lost all color. The narrative she had spent 3 years crafting, where Elena was the villain and she was the savior, had just been dismantled by a 7-year-old holding undeniable proof. "Where did you get those news clippings?" Victoria's voice turned cold as ice. "From the attic." Sophie held her chin up proudly. "From grandmother Sarah's trunk. You told me it was garbage, but it wasn't garbage. It was my family's real story." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, freezing all 3 of us in place. Richard appeared at the doorway in his robe, his hair disheveled from being woken up. He looked around the room, Victoria pale and furious, me standing defensively in front of the child, and Sophie clutching the photograph, her chest heaving. Complete confusion washed over his face. "What's going on here?" he asked. I heard shouting. Victoria immediately rushed to his side, switching back into her concerned stepmother routine. "Richard, darling, I'm so sorry to wake you. I found Mrs. Pauline in Sophie's room, showing her completely inappropriate items and filling her head with stories about the past to agitate her. Sophie is extremely unstable right now." "Daddy, look," Sophie interrupted, her voice cutting through Victoria's performance. She held Elena's photograph high in the air. Richard's face underwent a sudden wave of intense emotions: shock, grief, deep longing, and a profound sense of guilt. "Sophie," he rasped out, "where did you get that?" "From Mom's trunk in the attic." Sophie walked toward him with a confidence I had never seen in her before. "Mrs. Pauline helped me understand. Mom didn't leave me. She died in a car crash, didn't she, Daddy? She was trying to get home to me." Richard's composure broke completely. I watched a powerful CEO who managed millions of dollars break down in seconds as his 7-year-old daughter spoke her late mother's name with pure love. "Yes," he whispered, his voice choking up. "Yes, sweetheart. She died, trying to get home to you. She was buying you a birthday present. I knew it." Sophie's voice held a mix of pride and heartbreak. "I knew Mrs. Victoria was lying. She said Mom hated me." Richard snapped his head up, staring sharply at Victoria. For the first time, he was truly seeing his wife, not as a partner helping him raise his daughter, but as a woman who had systematically erased his late wife's memory and convinced his child she had been abandoned. "Victoria," he spoke in a terrifyingly controlled tone, "we need to talk." Victoria wasn't ready to surrender. She had spent 3 years building her position of authority and wasn't about to let it crumble. "Richard, you have to understand," she stepped toward him. I was trying to help Sophie move forward. All the therapists said that if she viewed Elena's loss as a choice rather than a random tragedy, it would be easier for her to process. It gives her a sense of control. No reputable therapist would ever suggest lying to a child that her mother abandoned her. Richard's voice cracked like ice. That's absurd. And Mrs. Victoria wanted to send me away. Sophie seized what might be her only chance to be heard. To a school in Switzerland. To live with strangers who don't know anything about my mom, grandmother Sarah, or our garden. Richard turned back to Victoria, disbelief written across his face. What is she talking about? Switzerland, the Meadowbrook Institute. Victoria stammered. We discussed this, Richard. Dr. Martinez recommended residential care for her attachment issues, and... I never agreed to send Sophie to Switzerland. Richard exploded, his voice echoing through the house. I agreed to consider increasing her therapy sessions, not exiling my daughter to another continent. But you signed the preliminary paperwork, Victoria yelled back. Just last week. You signed. I signed a referral form for a local family therapy consultation. Richard's anger boiled over. Not enrollment forms for an overseas institution. A heavy silence filled the room as the reality settled in. Victoria had forged documents and manipulated the situation, attempting to trick Richard into sending Sophie away. The mask of the perfect stepmother had been torn off, exposing a deeply selfish, calculating scheme underneath. Sophie was still clutching her mother's photo, her dark eyes flashing with hope as she looked up at her father. Daddy, can Mrs. Pauline stay? She showed me how to plant flowers. She actually listens to me, and she helped me remember that I used to be a happy kid. Richard turned to look at me. For the first time since I stepped foot in this house, he wasn't looking past me like I was just some low-level staff member in a uniform. Is it true? He asked. Everything Sophie said about the trunk in the attic? Every word, I said quietly. Elena's mother saved everything. The photos, the medical records, newspaper clippings, letters. Sophie had a right to know the truth about her family, while Victoria was sitting there telling her that Elena abandoned her. I cast a cold glance at Victoria, who was spiraling right in front of us. And that's not even the worst of what she lied about. Richard went silent for a long time. He was processing the horrifying extent of the emotional manipulation his daughter had been subjected to under the guise of what's best for her. When he finally spoke, his voice was eerily quiet, but there was a terrifying finality to it. Victoria, pack your bags. You're leaving now. 6 months later, I was standing in what used to be Victoria's formal sitting room. It had been completely transformed into a bright, warm space. Sophie did her homework here, and I used it to plan out our seasonal flower rotations. The delicate, untouchable silk draped over everything was gone, replaced by rich earth tones, and the fragile antiques had been swapped for sturdy oak furniture. Finally, the room could handle the energy of a real child who was actually allowed to be herself. Sophie was sitting at the big oak table we picked out together, focused on a colored pencil sketch. It was our design for the memorial garden we were building for Elena. She was 8 now, 3 inches taller, and 12 pounds heavier. When a child finally feels safe and deeply loved, their cheeks get that full, healthy glow back. Even better, she was an absolute chatterbox now. She was making up for 3 lost years of silence with a constant stream of questions, stories, observations, and pure curiosity. Grandma? Pauline? She looked up from her paper. Do you think Mom will like the fountain we picked out? I want to make sure the water sounds happy, not sad. I think your mother would love anything that makes you happy, I said, sitting down beside her to look at the drawing. She'd inherited every bit of Elena's artistic talent. The garden layout was gorgeous and practical, with winding paths leading to quiet seating areas, and flower beds arranged so something new would bloom straight through spring, summer, and fall. Getting to this point hadn't happened overnight. After Richard kicked Victoria out, it turned into a brutal 3-month legal war over the divorce settlement. Porch. At the same time, Sophie went through what her new therapist called delayed grief. Years of bottled-up pain came pouring out like a broken dam. Anger, sadness, confusion, and fear all tangled together. There were nights filled with nightmares, full-blown meltdowns, and days where she fell into silent funks. But there were just as many breakthroughs. Porch. Like the day she asked if she could start calling me Grandma Pauline instead of Mrs. Pauline. Or the afternoon she pulled a music box out of Elena's trunk, spent hours learning how to wind it up, and danced around the room to the melody. Or the stormy night she crawled into my lap and whispered, "I'm scared, but I know I'm not alone anymore." Richard went through his own transformation too. Porch. The distant workaholic tech mogul was replaced by a father determined to actually get to know his daughter. To know the little girl Elena had fought so hard to protect, he completely restructured his global board schedule just to make sure he was home for dinner every night. Porch. He learned how to braid Sophie's hair the way Elena used to, and he started reading her the bedtime stories mentioned in Sarah's old letters. "How could I have been so blind?" he asked me one evening, about 2 months after Victoria was permanently removed from the estate. Porch. We were sitting in his study, a room that was no longer an intimidating power center, but a cozy space covered in Sophie's artwork. How did I let someone convince me my own daughter was the problem? I chose my words carefully. "Grief makes us vulnerable," I told him. Porch. When we feel like we're drowning, we cling to anyone who promises to keep us afloat, even if they have no intention of actually saving us. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at a photo on his desk of Elena holding Sophie as a baby. "She was so vibrant," he said softly. "Elena, I mean, it wasn't just how she looked. It was this inner light, this joy she found in everything." Porch. When she passed, I felt like that light went out forever. Victoria promised she could bring it back, but all she really did was turn down the lights around me so the dark felt normal. Looking at Sophie right now, happily humming while she colored her sketch, I knew that light was still alive in her daughter. It had just been buried for a while, waiting for the right soil to bloom again. Porch. "Dad's home early," Sophie announced as Richard's car pulled up the driveway. She jumped out of her chair, ran to the window, and waved wildly as he parked near the main entry. Nowadays, Richard walked right through the front door like a regular dad coming home from work, instead of using the service entrance like an employer inspecting the staff. Porch. That tiny detail marked a massive shift. This was finally Sophie's home. "How are my favorite girls doing today?" Richard asked as he walked in, loosening his tie and rubbing Sophie's hair. The easy warmth between them still amazed me. It was a complete 180 from the cold, formal relationship they had when I first arrived. Porch. "We're designing the fountain for Mom's garden," Sophie said proudly, holding up her drawing. "And Grandma Pauline taught me how to prune the dead buds so the roses keep blooming all summer." "Grandma Pauline," Richard said, turning to me with genuine affection. "Have I told you lately how grateful I am that you're part of this family?" Family. Porch. Every time either of them used that word, a wave of warmth hit my chest. I had come here as cheap labor, a desperate widow willing to take anything just to escape debt and the freezing cold. Now, I was something I never dreamed I'd be again. Someone irreplaceable to people who loved me. Not because of the work I did, but simply because of who I was. Porch. "Actually," Richard said, sitting down on the new plush sofa, "I brought home some news I think you'll both be excited about." Sophie immediately climbed into his lap, something that would have been strictly forbidden back in Victoria's day. But now it was her birthright. "What news?" Porch. "The kind that comes in official legal envelopes," Richard said, pulling a thick stack of documents from his briefcase. "Pauline, I've been working with my trust attorneys to make your place here official. On paper, you are no longer an employee." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've set up an irrevocable living trust," he explained, breaking down the legalities. Porch. It guarantees you high-end housing for life, full medical coverage, and a generous monthly allowance. You will never have to worry about making a living again. In exchange, you are legally designated as Sophie's companion, home tutor, and legal guardian. If anything ever happens to me, you have full legal authority over her care. No one can ever take her from you. Orch. My hands trembled as I held the documents, trying to process what he was saying. Financial freedom. Absolute legal protection. It was an ironclad agreement ensuring that no matter what unexpected curveballs life threw at us, Sophie and I would never be torn apart. "Why?" I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of his generosity. Richard's expression turned deeply serious. "Orch. Because when Victoria tried to erase Elena and push Sophie away, Sophie almost lost everything that mattered to her. Because when I was blind enough to trust a woman who saw my daughter as a burden instead of a treasure, I almost lost her completely. And because when everyone else looked away, you stood up and fought for her. Orch." He paused, hugging Sophie tightly, as if he still couldn't believe she was safe in his arms. "And because it's what Elena would have wanted," he added gently. "She would have wanted Sophie to have a grandmother who truly cherished her, someone to keep her mother's memory alive and guide her as she grows up. You gave Sophie her voice back. You gave her confidence and a place where she belongs. Orch, I could never repay that debt, but I can use what I have to make sure the two of you never have to worry about losing each other again." I wiped away a tear, looking back on the long road that brought me here. Orch, the crushing grief of losing Conrad, the medical debt that pushed me to the edge, the sheer desperation that forced me to take a low-level job, and that one reckless stand I took to protect a child who wasn't mine by blood, but felt bound to my soul anyway. "There's one more thing," Richard said, his tone lightening up. "Sophie has a special request." Orch. Sophie squirmed in his lap, suddenly shy but determined. "Grandma Pauline," she said softly, using the name that still made my heart skip a beat. "Can you help me plant Mom's roses in the garden? I want to use the seeds for Conrad's memory. The ones you brought from your old home." Conrad's memory, the rose strain my husband and I had spent years breeding. Orch. When I lost my house to foreclosure, I thought they were gone forever. I'd brought a few precious seeds here with me, gifting one of the first blooms to a lonely little girl sitting by a window. Now that same little girl wanted to use them to honor her own lost loved one. Orch. "I think," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat, "that Conrad would be deeply honored to know his roses were blooming in Elena's garden, and I think your mother would be so happy to see something beautiful growing out of all our loss." Sophie beamed, slid off her father's lap, and threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. "I love you, Grandma Pauline," she whispered. Orch. "Thank you for helping me remember how to be happy." Holding this precious child, who had saved me just as much as I had saved her, I couldn't help but marvel at the unexpected ways our lives intertwine. Loss and hope, endings and beginnings, lost family and found family, all woven together into this complex tapestry of fate. I came to Blackwood Manor as a broken woman with nothing to my name. Orch. I was staying as a grandmother, a guardian, and a cherished part of a family. We had all been broken in our own ways, but together, piece by piece, we were healing. Later that evening, the three of us worked in the memorial garden together, pressing the Conrad's memory seeds into the rich soil that would soon carry Elena's legacy. Orch. I felt the quiet presence of the loved ones we'd lost, right alongside the bright promise of the new life we were building. Sophie chattered non-stop as she worked, her voice a constant stream of questions, discoveries, and big dreams for the future. Richard listened to every single word, knowing now never to take his daughter's voice for granted. Orch. And as I buried my hands deep into the dark earth, a quiet peace washed over me. I knew that with enough time, patience, and love, even the deepest wounds could become the soil for something far more beautiful than what was lost. By next summer, those roses would be in full bloom, vibrant, fragrant, and resilient against the cold, just like the new family we rebuilt from the ashes of our old lives. Orch. Just like the love that started with a single flower left on a lonely child's windowsill. Just like the courage it took for Sophie to reclaim her voice, speak the truth, and claim her place in the world. The golden hour light stretched across the garden I was now caring for. Not as an employee, but as family. Porch. I realized then that sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as devastating loss. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's built on choice, on fierce devotion, and on the simple revolutionary act of seeing a child's true worth when everyone else treats her like a burden. Sophie was going to grow up surrounded by love. Porch. She would always know her mother's story, and she'd always have a grandmother willing to fight for her future, no matter what came our way. Porch. And as for me, I got to live out my remaining years knowing that my own losses had led me right where I was meant to be, given a second chance at family, and the privilege of guiding an extraordinary little girl into the amazing woman her mother always dreamed she'd become. As Sophie's bright laughter echoed through the evening air, I smiled to myself. Porch. It really was the most beautiful ending I could have ever imagined.